Okay, so we're going to combine Chapter 31 and 32 and have a short test. It's 25 questions, multiple choice, and I'll do a quick review here for it. The KKK, there are a couple of questions here about, in the 1920s, the KKK, this was a reaction against the forces of diversity and modernity. These forces of diversity and modernity that were transforming American culture. Because of that, the KKK reacted strongly against it, and they were opposed to, remember all of the antis in the chapter, they were anti-fundamentalists, they were opposed to birth control, they were against pacifists, they didn't like Catholics, and all the other antis. But one thing that they were not opposed to was prohibition. The Red Scare in 1919-1920, this was provoked by the Public Association of Labor Violence with its fear of revolution. Okay, so you had the Palmer raids, the Mitchell-Palmer raids, and this association of communism with revolution, and that was because of the Russian Revolution and Lenin, and so there's a huge fear, quite hysterical fear of communism and a public's association with violence and communism. Most spectacular example of lawlessness and gangsterism in the 1920s was Chicago and Al Capone. Business people in general, those that were business owners, reacted to the Red Scare, used the Red Scare as an opportunity to break the backs of the fledgling unions. Then we also have this 1920s sports, and among the major figures promoted by mass media was Babe Ruth and Jack Dempsey. With the advent of radio and motion pictures, much of the diversity of immigrant culture was lost. The book talks a little bit about how radio then kind of makes the world a little bit smaller. It makes that diverse culture within certain communities a little bit, it basically equalizes everybody. That again happens in the 1950s with TV, and 1960s with TV. The first talkie motion picture was The Jazz Singer. It's the first talkie. Jazz music was developed for the most part by American blacks in the jazz age, 1920s. When elected president in 1928, Hoover combined small-town values with his wide experience in modern corporate America. Small-town values with his wide experience in corporate America. Remember that Hoover was previously, during World War I, in charge of the Food Administration. He was very gifted in the area of organization and accounting. Not so much gifted in the area of leadership. The most colorful presidential candidate in the 1920s was Al Smith. Al Smith, he did not win. He was defeated a few times. The last time he was defeated, FDR was his vice presidential candidate. And then eventually FDR becomes president, defeating Hoover. But Al Smith was a very colorful candidate. Henry Ford, he was credited with contributing relatively very cheap automobiles to America. This makes the car affordable because of the assembly line, affordable to the average American. Lindbergh's solo flight across the Atlantic made him an American hero, especially because of his wholesome youthfulness, and this contrasted with the cynicism and debunking of the jazz age. So Lindbergh and his wholesome youthfulness made him an American hero. The bonus expeditionary force marched on Washington, D.C. in 1932 to demand immediate full payment of the bonuses that they were promised as World War I veterans. So they march on Washington, and this becomes a big problem because you have veterans of World War I marching on Washington, and then you have a president that calls out the Army to put down this march. So you have current Army officers going against past retired Army officers. It kind of blows up. One of Hoover's chief strengths as a presidential candidate was his talent for administration and organization. The most tenacious pursuer of radical elements of the Red Scare was Mitchell Palmer. Tenacious pursuer of the radical elements within the Red Scare was Mitchell Palmer. The Volstead Act. Volstead Act is prohibition in outlawing alcohol. So the enforcement of the Volstead Act met the strongest resistance from eastern city dwellers. The trial of John Scopes in 1925 centered on the issue of teaching evolution in public schools. Al Smith, some of the characteristics. All of the following sometimes are referred to as political liabilities for Al Smith. These are liabilities because people thought that they would hurt his chances to get elected. The first and foremost was the fact that he was the first presidential candidate to run as a Catholic. People thought that if he was elected, then he would take orders from the Pope. So that was a liability. He also supported the repeal of Prohibition. That was a liability. He wanted to get rid of Prohibition. It also was a liability that he had horrible speaking skills, especially on the radio. And he had a big city background. Those are all liabilities. A question here about the monkey trial, the Scopes monkey trial, and how this fundamental religion remained a vibrant force in American spiritual life. Harding's cabinet proved to be incompetent and corrupt. Albert Fall was probably the worst, which the following members of President Harding's cabinet proved to be incompetent and correct. Albert Fall. We also have then Republican economic policies under Harding hoped to encourage the government activity to assist business along the path to profits. Warren Harding talked about the role of government is to help business. The business of government is to help business. Teapot Dome scandal involved the corrupt mishandling of naval oil reserves. And this involved the Secretary of the Interior, and then some of the Navy was kind of involved as well because they were. If you read the reading and paid attention, their issue was that Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, was very interested in controlling the Teapot Dome oil reserves. Somehow he convinced Harding that the oil was kind of draining out and needed to be captured as quickly as possible. And the Navy was in the process of transforming their Navy from a coal Navy into an oil Navy. And so the Navy was very interested in oil as well, and it all kind of led to some mishandling of funds. Then there's one question here about Silent Calvin Coolidge, sometimes referred to as Silent Cal. And one thing that he is not known for is his wordiness. He is honest, frugal, shy, and cautious. He is not wordy. He's called Silent Cal. Famous story of a reporter at a White House ball. Two reporters are standing in the corner, and they said, "Man, he never talks." So, yeah, I bet you $50 I can get him to say more than 2 words. So you're on. So the reporter walks across the room and says, "Mr. President, do me a favor. I got a bet with my buddy." that can make you say more than 2 words. Do me a favor, say more than 2 words. He looks at him and he says, "You lose," and he walks away. That pretty much is the review for Chapter 31, 32 tests.